Chapter 7. It was 2 months later, and Prince Alban was helping the latest group of settlers adjust to their new home. Within a few weeks of his and Valerie's return to the kingdom of Vandan, a small group of farmers and their families had arrived, carrying all of their possessions with them. They were mostly from the borders of Elgon, where goblins and ogres roamed freely and where bandit attacks were common. They had heard that a giantess who was rumored to be friendly to humans was now living in the old castle, and they had decided to go and ask her permission to live, under her protection, of course. For Valerie, this had been a wonderful thing to happen. As much as she and Alban enjoyed spending their time together, they had begun to miss the company of others, especially Alban, who sometimes felt extremely out of place living in this giant world. There had also been very little to do, except making sure that the remaining goblins stayed away from the castle, which they eventually did so. Now, a couple months later, and over 100 people had arrived at the castle seeking a new place to live. They were almost, without exception, very poor, but the vaults of the castle were filled with riches and supplies, and there was enough fruit and vegetables growing naturally around the castle to support both Valerie and her ever-growing population of citizens. With her help, the settlers soon managed to build a decent village for themselves just south of the castle, where there was enough good soil for them to start their farming life anew. On this particular day, Alban was helping out a group of travelers whose homes were destroyed by a recent ogre attack. He was helping them find a place to camp. Since Valerie was now the queen of Vandan, he might one day be regarded as the king, though he was supposed to marry his beloved first. Up until now, he hadn't thought about it too much, but he supposed that the people might begin to wonder what exactly his relationship with her was. "I'll propose to her tonight," he said to himself. "It might be a little sudden for her, but we've already made love to each other, and she no longer doubts my strong feelings for her. She'll say yes. I know she will." His thoughts were interrupted by a loud cry, and he looked up to see a troop of soldiers on horseback emerging from behind a giant peach tree. They were bearing down on the village with great speed, causing everyone to panic. Alban recognized their insignia. They were soldiers of Elgon, no doubt, sent here by his father to get rid of the giantess once and for all and bring him back home. The riders, who were about 50 in number, spotted him and headed towards him. The captain ordered his men to round up the villagers while he dismounted and walked right up to Alban. "Hello," Alban said, friendly, while his hand rested on his sword hilt. "Where is she?" the captain interrupted. "Where is that giant maiden who insulted our king and mocked our army?" "Lady Valerie is our queen, and you will respect her," yelled one of the farmers. He was swiftly repaid by a punch in the gut. Alban decided it was now time for him to draw his sword, though he still hoped the soldiers weren't really going to attack the unarmed villagers. "She went to fetch water from the stream," he replied, which was the truth. "She'll be back any moment now, and I suggest you leave before she does." The captain began to laugh, but Alban had been right, for at that very moment Valerie came walking into sight. She was carrying 2 30-foot-high pails of water, and from her clothing appeared more like a peasant girl than a queen. But she found these clothes were easier to work in, and she usually spent at least several hours a day helping to build new homes for the immigrants, serving them food and water and so on. As soon as she caught eye of the soldiers, she put her pails down and advanced towards them. They in turn drew their bows and aimed straight up at her. The captain drew his own sword, and Alban now saw that a confrontation was almost certainly going to happen. "That's close enough, giant," the captain yelled. "Our arrows are tipped with a lethal poison. One further move from you, and I give the order to fire." Valerie stood, as still as she could. She was dreading the thought of yet another battle, and this time it looked as if it could be one she'll lose. The soldiers were too heavily armed for Alban and the villagers to take on, and she herself certainly didn't want any poisoned arrows fired at her. "What is it that you want?" she asked, hoping to win a little time to come up with a plan. "Ah, so you are willing to be reasonable," the captain smiled, pleased to see that his words seemed to have frightened her. "That's excellent. All right. These are the king's demands. His son is to return home to Elgon immediately. So are all the others, who will be punished for deserting their country and setting up camp alongside an enemy stronghold. As for you, if you are not willing to come with us peacefully to be locked up in your own dungeon for the rest of your days, we will be forced to shoot you immediately." There were cries of protest and dismay from the men and women of the village, which were quickly silenced. The soldiers still had their bows trained on her, and they seemed very eager to fire. Valerie still had no plan, and she wasn't going to let anyone be wrongly imprisoned, least of all herself. There was nothing for it. She was going to have to fight, and hope that it would give at least Alban and the others a chance to escape. She took a step forward, and the captain gave the order to fire. She quickly raised her hand to protect her face and managed to block almost all the arrows. As they pierced the skin of her hand, she shrieked in pain. It felt as if a bucket of acid had been spilt on her, stinging her right to the bone. After a few seconds, however, the pain lessened, and her hand began to feel numb. The soldiers, who had expected something more impressive to happen, quickly fired another volley at her. She blocked the arrows again, and decided that her turn had now come. "Is that the lethal poison I was threatened with?" she asked, taking another step closer. "Well, I suppose you should have tested to make sure it was lethal to giants like me first." As swiftly as she could, she bent down, grabbed the captain by the legs, and hung him upside down, 150 feet above the ground. He was swinging his sword around wildly until she took it away from him, and all the while he was screaming and shouting curses at her. His men were now completely uncertain what to do, but most of them kept their bows aimed at Valerie's head. "Tell them to drop their weapons," she ordered the captain, "or I'll let go, and we'll see if you survive the fall. I rather doubt it, though." The man tried to argue for a few moments, but he was starting to feel really afraid, and did as she ordered. As soon as the soldiers dropped their bows and swords, Alban and several of the men of the village confiscated them. Valerie then put the captain back down on the ground. He tried to make a run for his horse, but Alban sprang in before him and blocked his way. "If you're trying to run back to my father, forget it," he said. "You're not leaving without an apology, and a promise that we shall never be attacked again." "That's right," Valerie said, sitting next to them. "It's time for this hostility to stop. Why are you so determined to get rid of me in the first place? Is it because I'm a giant? Because you're afraid of me?" I'm just following His Majesty's orders," the man stammered. "Ever since his brother, General Monar, tried to supplant him, the king has vowed to destroy the source of the crisis. You." "My uncle," Alban exclaimed. "What has that bastard done to him?" He grabbed the captain on the shoulders and shook him. "Nothing," the man answered, breaking loose of Alban's grip. "The general fled before he could be captured, and some of the soldiers went with him. No one knows where he is now. The only rumors is that he was coming here." "Is that so?" Valerie pondered for a few seconds, before taking the captain up in her hand and addressing him. "Now listen here, little man. You and your little band will return to Elgon and inform your foolish, unreasonable king that this conflict is over. He had better not come and bother us again, or I swear I will go there, break his castle down, brick by brick, and then I'll take him and squeeze him in my hand until the blood comes out of his ears. Will you do that for me? The man nodded, but he didn't look at all comfortable. Valerie wondered what would happen to him if he delivered this news to King Mildar. It certainly wasn't impossible that he'd be imprisoned or executed for failing to complete his mission. She realized that another attack would come in any case, and that she needed to find a way to keep the king's mind occupied with other interests. So she stuck her hand in her pocket and pulled out a gold coin. It was about 3 feet wide, and the captain stared at it in wonder as she laid it in front of him. Centuries ago, she said, the men of Vandan searched all over the world for gold. They were obsessed with it. And right now, there is more gold in that castle's vaults than you can ever imagine. If King Mildar wants more than just one coin, he's going to have to assume a more tolerant state of mind. I'll pay him 3 of these coins each month, if he leaves me and my people in peace. I'll be sure to tell him, the captain said. He was trying to pick up the coin, but it was all too heavy for him to even budge. Valerie set him and the coin down again, and told him that it was time for him to leave. He obeyed, and she asked one of the villagers to lend the soldiers a wagon so they can transport the coin back to Elgon. A few minutes later, they were off. Chapter 8. The villagers then began to celebrate and to praise their leader for keeping them safe. She was just as glad as they were, but she saw that Alban looked unhappy. So she took her leave of the townfolk, and taking the prince up in her embrace, headed into the privacy of the castle. When they were alone in her bedroom, she put him down on a small table by her bedside, and she lay down on the bed. She kissed and stroked him a little before asking him if he was all right. It must be very hard for you, she said, being torn between 2 people you love when they're on opposite sides. If you'd like to go back to Elgon without me to make things right with your father. No, it's all right, he said. My father and I have had many arguments over the last few years, mostly because I wasn't interested in becoming his successor. I've always wanted to go my own way in life, and it frustrated him to no end. I would like to see him again, but right now I feel like I've done all that I can do to make things right. It's all up to him now. I understand. I mean, why waste time on what's sure to be a failed attempt? And now there's this business with your uncle and the soldiers attacking. It's a wonder we get any time to spend by ourselves. Well, we're alone now. Yes, we are. She began to fondle him again, eventually picking him up and bringing him close to her lips. But before she could plant a kiss on him, he stopped her. Wait, he insisted. Valerie, before we go on, I have to ask you something. I know this is hardly the right time. At that very moment, he was interrupted by a sound of a horn blowing loudly outside the castle doors. Valerie sprang to her feet, placing Alban on her shoulder and trusting him to hold on. When they were outside, they saw exactly what they'd been expecting to see. Another troop of soldiers. This time, however, the men didn't prepare to attack the giantess. Instead, they dismounted, and all in unison, sank to their knees. What's going on? Valerie asked, wondering how much more of this she could take. Hey, Alban cried suddenly. That's my uncle. Indeed, it was General Monar, still looking like royalty despite what had obviously been a long and difficult trip for him. The old general rose to his feet and held out his hand in greeting. Valerie got down on her knees and put her loved one on the ground beside her. He ran to embrace his uncle, and the soldiers, glad to see they were in no danger, rose as well. I feared you were dead, Alban exclaimed happily. But somehow you've arrived here. What are you doing here anyway? Nothing that has to do with getting rid of me, I hope, Valerie asked. No, Monar replied, looking up in awe at the colossal girl. In fact, we're here to join you, as it were. Rumors of the giant queen of Vandan are spreading throughout the lands, and not all men imagine you as an enemy. That's good, because if I have to tell one more asinine soldier that I am not hostile, we know that, Lady Valerie. Not all of us are as unknowledgeable as my brother. Now, the reason we are here is to offer you and Prince Alban our services. As your dutiful army, we're here to protect you and follow your commands. She said, finding the idea rather alluring. That is very kind of you, General, but I happen to make a very good army all by myself. The soldiers began to look worried and whisper amongst themselves. They had never heard a girl talk like this before, and they were amazed how much strength she seemed to possess. Well, in that case, the general continued, please allow us to live here, in your kingdom, as citizens. Our opinions about you have made us unpopular back in Elgon, and we cannot go back. And I'm sure there's some other way we can be of service to you. Of course there is, the giantess laughed. I was only having you a little. You see? I'm sorry, but that's just the way I am. Seriously, though. You and your men are welcome to stay here. And our families? May we send word to them so they can come and join us? Yes, certainly. Come, let me show you to the village. She placed both Alban and Monar on her shoulder and headed off towards the settlement, leaving the soldiers to follow her on foot. Unbelievable, Monar said to his nephew. She's just unbelievable. And this is the woman you want to spend the rest of your life with? Yes, uncle. She's the one I love. There's no one else like her, although she can be a little too much to handle sometimes. I heard that, Valerie said, turning to her little passengers and smiling. She gave Alban a slight nudge with her chin, and he fell off her shoulder, screaming in surprise. But she caught him just as he reached her waist, and put him down safely on the ground, along with the general. Here we are, she said. Now let's get all of you a place to stay. It was late at night before Alban had Valerie all to himself again. They were lying in Valerie's Titan-sized bed, or rather, she was lying in it. He was sitting happily on top of her bosom, wearing nothing but his underwear, playing with a few strands of her hair. She was fondling his body, gently squeezing his chest and arms, thrilled that she could have such a muscular man as a lover, and still be able to let him sit upon her breast, as if he were a little pet. So, darling, she said, feeling ready for a night of pleasure, even though she was a bit sleepy. What was it you wanted to ask me before we were so unfortunately interrupted? Oh, yes, of course. I was going to ask you, well, I mean, what I wanted to say was, oh, just ask me already, she giggled. You know very well that my answer will be yes. You knew? he stammered. She laughed and hugged his body in her hand. Alban looked a little embarrassed and climbed out of her hand. He slid in between her breasts, a spot he had always enjoyed spending time in. "You're not the hardest man to read, my little prince," she said. "I could tell that something has been bothering you for days now. And I mean, what else could it be but the worryings of a man who doesn't know how to ask his girl to marry him?" "So that's it then? You'll be my wife?" She laughed again at his awkwardness. Bringing him toward her lips, she wrapped his body up, letting him bathe in the warmth and moistness of her kiss. "Yes, my love, I will marry you, but on one condition." "Oh, yes? What's that?" "That you'll let me plan the wedding. You may be a great warrior, sweetie, but you don't really have a taste for the romantic side of life." "Oh, is that so? Well, I guess I'll have to prove myself then." He took off his underwear, giving her a nice view indeed, before wriggling in underneath her gown. "Don't get lost," she called after him, knowing full well that he was very familiar with her body. Then she just sank back into the pillows and let him have his way with her. "My sweet prince," she thought afterwards, long after he had fallen asleep in her cleavage. "You've certainly come a long way, haven't you? Are you ready to go even further with me?" "I hope so, because I'm never letting you go." Sleep tight, Alban, and sweet dreams. And with those thoughts, she drifted off herself, happy that she'd found true love, even if it came from a person she'd never expected she'd fall in love with. The end.